When I first got into miniature painting, it was in a hotel room with some of the cheapest brushes I could buy and cramped over a desk with really horrible lighting. And I kept reminding myself, I want to do this. You see, I'd been watching YouTube tutorials off and on for a couple of years at that point and knew that this was a part of the hobby that I wanted to get into. I'd done classical model building and not really getting into the painting side of things, but wargaming was really changing that for me and making me want to start painting. And I had to just keep reminding myself to stick with it. It felt like everything I was pumping out wasn't good enough. And I want people to know that we're not in this alone when we feel this way. So I hope you guys will follow along with me, and hopefully I can teach you guys how to get started, how to keep going, and some new tips and tricks along the way. No perfection needed. Welcome to Tabletop Glory. My name's Graham Johnson. Maybe you felt a little intimidated by some tutorials you've seen in the past, or the laundry list of tools it seems like some people say you need, or even just some of the jargon that we use within the hobby. Hopefully I can help break things down and make things feel a little more simple and approachable. That all said, let's get started. When I was first getting started, my lighting was pretty terrible. I wasn't aware of how my color blindness really affected things at that point in time, and I was painting under a warm desk light. And I was really able to fix that quite easily by switching to daylight bulbs, which is something that I highly recommend whether you're colorblind or not, as it's going to give a much more accurate representation of what the colors are going to look like under natural lighting. And if it looks good under natural lighting, it's going to look good in most settings. Now, if you don't have a great desk lamp, it's not the end of the world, and if you don't feel comfortable spending the money on a daylight bulb, as they can be a little bit more expensive, simply setting up your hobby supplies near an open window and working in good natural daylight is going to be more than enough to get yourself started. Now, depending upon how long you've been in the miniature painting community, one of the cardinal sins that a lot of people are going to talk about is painting directly out of the bottle. Now, not all paint brands allow you to do this. You might have some that are like an eyedropper style bottle, in which case you're going to need some kind of palette, but something like Games Workshop or Tamiya, a lot of those pop open or screw open, and you can dip your paintbrush in and paint directly out of the product. Now, a lot of people will tell you that you should never ever do this. Now, if you've ever watched me on a live stream, I do this a lot. Now, there is a little built-in palette on Citadel paint bottles. A lot of people don't really like that, but honestly, you can kind of scrape off the excess either on the rim or on that little palette, and just a tiny little drop of water and swirl it around on the inside of the rim, and honestly, you can just paint directly out of the bottle that way. But that comes with the knowledge of knowing the consistency of the paint, and that's something that's going to come over time. So if you don't feel like buying a palette, you can use the inside of the lid as a palette to kind of mix some water in. But if it comes to mixing different colors of paint, something that you're definitely going to want to stay away from is using a paper plate. A lot of people want to use a paper plate, but really all that does is it sucks all the moisture directly out of the paint, and it causes it to dry so much faster, and you end up having to race against the clock. Now, this is a lesson I learned the hard way when I first got into miniature painting, and I didn't realize I was learning it the hard way until I bought a plastic palette to use, and they're super cheap. But if you're not 100% sure if you're going to be sticking with this hobby, something that you can do to a paper plate is to just spray it with a little bit of spray paint and let that dry, and then put your paint on top of that. It'll act like a moisture barrier and stop the paint from soaking into the paper quite as bad as it would if you just put it directly on the paper plate. But honestly, just use an old Tupperware lid. It'll be way better of an experience. Now, as long as we're on the subject of palettes, something that you might want to keep in mind is that if you want to upgrade from a plastic palette, but you don't want to spend the money on a wet palette, something that you can do is just use an old sheet of glass. Now, if you don't have some glass lying around, you can go to a like refurbishment store or like a Goodwill or something like that and just get an old picture frame and take the piece of glass out and use that as your palette. It's gonna act kind of like a hybrid of the plastic palette and the wet palette. Things are gonna stay wet just as long as they would in the plastic palette, and it's gonna be super easy to clean, but you're also gonna have this really good experience with mixing the colors and really being able to see the color on the glass. And that is something that you will notice when you switch to a wet palette, is they blend really well because of how moist everything stays. Whereas with the glass palette, you can just see the blend and you know when it's fully blended. So let's take a second to talk about some of the jargon or the terms that we use in miniature painting. Specifically, I'm going to just start out simple with talking about the paints. Now, a lot of times you're going to hear us talk about acrylics. Now, that is the type of paint that we typically use. Now, some people do use enamels, but that tends to need some harsh chemicals to help break it down, to thin it out and do blending and other things like that. And that's not really conducive to someone who's getting into the hobby. Whereas acrylics are more often water-based. They blend super easy with each other. They blend with water really easy, so that means they thin down into washes and glazes, which we'll talk about in a moment. And they're just a really enjoyable experience. That also means that when it comes to picking out paintbrushes, you can use stuff that either says it's for acrylics or if it says it's for watercolors. Now, I tend to pick out paintbrushes that are meant for both, and the reason I do that is because watercolor brushes have a nice, really thick body, which they're designed to soak up a ton of paint and hold it and keep it moist, and that gives you a lot of working time. Now, unfortunately, they don't hold their tip the same way that a purely acrylic paintbrush does. Those will hold their tip and be a nice fine tip for a really long time. And a lot of the hobby paintbrushes, regardless of the brand, usually tend to be a hybrid of the two anyway, so that's why I tend to look for that when I'm buying my own paintbrushes. Now, I mentioned just a second ago washes and glazes. Now, those are two terms you're going to hear a lot, and more often than not, they get used kind of interchangeably, even though they're really not something that is interchangeable. Washes are thinned down and are meant to settle in the recesses to add dark shadows and shading. Think of it as a way of like muddying up something, whereas a glaze is meant to be a tint across the surface and somewhat evenly distributed across the surface. So if you wanted to paint, like, let's say a lighting effect, like a torch or a lantern or something is casting light on part of a character, you would use a glaze on one side to maybe add some purples or dark colors to be the shadow, and you'd add some warmer tones to be those highlights, but it would be on top of the skin color that you have already painted. That's a glaze. Whereas the wash might be to put some darkness in the wrinkles on the face and in the eyes and around the nose and mouth to add that shadow and depth. Okay, two of the most important things you've probably heard us talking about: highlights and shadows. Now, shadows are pretty easy to figure out, right? It's the spot where the shadow is. But oftentimes when we talk about highlights, you'll hear us talking about edge highlights. Now, it's pretty obvious to figure out what a highlight is, right? It's the shiny spot on the top of a balding man's head. But what is an edge highlight? Well, when we take a look at science fiction armor, especially in miniature painting, this is where we're going to notice it the most. But once you understand what it is, you're going to start seeing it everywhere. So let's look at a typical Space Marine, and we'll be using a picture from Games Workshop's website just because it's a prime example. Even if it's their heavy metal style, it's still a prime example of what edge highlighting is. Essentially, you're drawing the thinnest line possible along any edge. And what that kind of does is it does the comic book thing where it makes that item pop. Now, I'm going to let you in on a little secret that Games Workshop does really well that not everyone talks about. And you don't see it on all the models, and you don't see it all over the model, but you do see it in a select few places where they will draw a nice thin black line separating parts of the model. And this isn't just to add shadow, it kind of tricks your brain into seeing them as two different objects. So you might sometimes see a black line drawn around the edge of some leather pouches, or separating two pieces of armor that happen to be the same color but are butting up against each other but aren't necessarily in alignment with one another. And similar to how the color of my hands blend in, but yet you can still see the shadow from the gap where my fingertips don't all the way meet up with the rest of my hand, you still get a bit of a shadow. And so what they'll do is they'll paint in along the edge of those two pieces of armor, or those two objects that are painted the same color, and just give them a little bit of shadow, a little bit of help. And I tend to refer to that as an edge shadow, but not a lot of people do that, and I don't tend to do it that often. I think less is more, but it's something to keep in mind as a new miniature painter when you're looking at someone else's work, when you're trying to break down why did they do what they did, and can I do it as well. Once you start to find these little tips and tricks, it makes breaking down someone else's work a little bit easier. Okay, so we got a bunch of what might feel like nonsense out of the way. Let's crack in with some real tips for getting started today. Number 1, wash the model. Preferably wash the model before you put it together. Nice, warm, soapy water doesn't need to be hot, but you do need to try and get it clean. More often than not, the metal molds that clamp together to create the model sprue, which is the part that all your pieces are attached to, gets sprayed with some kind of an oily residue that is the release that allows the plastic parts to break free from the molds super easily. Now, most companies do a really great job at washing this off before the model ever gets to you, but it's not always a perfect process, and sometimes you end up with a model that is still a little greasy. And you may not be able to see it, and you may not be able to feel it, but I promise you, as soon as your paints touch it, they will not stick to the model. You will get super frustrated, and you'll find yourself painting over the same spot over and over again to the point where you feel like you're ruining the paint job around it. And you could ruin the paint job around it, and it'll be a real point of frustration. Think of it like when you're trying to write with a ballpoint pen, and then suddenly it just stops writing for some reason, so you keep writing over it and over it and over it until it sticks. And then you've basically almost shoved the pen all the way through the piece of paper at that point. It's kind of that same frustrating experience. And trying to fix that after the fact, once you've started painting, can kind of be a bit of a pain. Personally, if I run into that, I try to use a Q-tip with a little bit of rubbing alcohol, and I do my best to not kind of mess up the paint around it, and I just kind of dab at the spot that's having the problem, let it air dry, let the paint cure all the way, we'll talk about that term in a bit here, and then repaint it, and you should be fine. But honestly, washing the models first is a huge first step to making sure that you never have to deal with that in the first place. Number 2, don't stress about the details. Right now, we're just trying to get started. Just focus on putting down your base colors at first. A lot of miniature painters out there will talk about your base coats and your highlights and your shadows and where you should start. And some people will say to start from the shadows and work your way up. And some people will say start from the highlights and work your way down. And GW tells you to start in the middle and work in both directions at once. That's a lot of information to take in all at once, especially for somebody who's just getting started. And it's okay to feel frustrated or even a little bit lost with all that information flowing around. At the end of the day, this is about developing your own process and how you want to paint. If it makes sense to start in the middle for you and work in both directions, then start in the middle and work in both directions. If it makes sense to you to start in the shadows so that you don't lose track of how dark you want everything, then paint from the shadows and work your way up. Just know that brighter colors are going to be difficult to paint on top of darker colors. And although there are reasons to start from the shadows and work your way up when it comes to blending and getting everything to look good together, you can do it regardless of which direction, from top to bottom, bottom to top, middle, out, it doesn't matter. You will get there eventually anyway. It's just a matter of time. And sweating the details now and trying to plan for every little bit of rope and cord and every little button on the shirt, just enjoy the process for what it is. Block out your colors. Take your time. If you need to walk away from the miniature, walk away from the miniature. If you need to only work on it in 10-minute increments, you're just getting started. There's no point in trying to work through a shaky hand because you're getting a little anxious and your heart rate is racing. Take your time, enjoy the process. Tip number 3. Do your best to try and get as smooth a base coat as possible, regardless of what your base coat looks like. I promise you, putting in the time and the effort to get a nice smooth finish in the beginning is going to be an excellent foundation to work in whatever direction you want to go in. If it doesn't look good from the beginning, it's not going to look good later on. And that's kind of hard to wrap your mind around after I just said don't sweat the details. But I promise you that if you've got cords or buttons and you've just got a very nice thin coat of paint, but a nice solid coat of paint over everything, you're not going to muddy up those details. You're always going to be able to come back in and pick them out later, whether your hand's not shaking, you're feeling inspired to go and tackle all those little details, or it's just time and you've got nothing else to work on and you want to go ahead and try your hand at the little things. If you've got a nice thin base coat and you haven't gooped the paint on anywhere, it's going to be a much more enjoyable experience for you, I promise. Real quick, I want to take a second to talk about your paints. Now, as a new miniature painter, you're going to just click the bottle back down, screw it back down, whatever the case is. But if you want your paints to last forever, because this bottle is 10 years old, a lot of you aren't going to believe that because it's a Citadel bottle. This is 10-year-old and it's still wet. I can still use this 10-year-old bottle of paint. That is because I took care that anytime I got paint on the inside of the lid where it clamps shut or where the threads are on a bottle of paint, I clean it. And if paint dries in it, I take the tip of my needle nose plier and very gently go in as if it's a pair of tweezers and pull that gunk back out. That is a great way to make sure your paints last forever, because I know we don't always get to paint every day and sometimes you gotta pack everything away and you don't know when you're gonna paint next. But if you take a few minutes when you're packing your stuff away and you just double check and make sure that the bottle is seated closed all the way or screwed down all the way before you put the paint away, I promise you the paint is still gonna be good even if it's these Citadel bottles. I promise. Because I've got a lot of these Citadel bottles, including several washes that are over 10 years old and they're still good. I still use them all the time. I promise you the bottles are not as bad as people want you to believe they are. You just have to clean the lid. And a lot of people are going to say you shouldn't have to do that, and maybe they're right. But I promise you that at some point or another, even the dropper bottles you have to screw on are going to need a little bit of help. And last off, I think I've said this a few times already, let the model dry. Let it cure all the way. And what do I mean by curing? So when the paint is dry to the touch, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's cured. That's like the difference between when you're baking a cake and you can see the skin on the top of the cake versus the inside still being gooey. When you're painting a miniature, it might be dry to the touch, which can allow you to start putting layers on top of it, but it's not cured all the way, which means the moisture from the new layers you're adding could reactivate the paint you just put down. Now that can lead to a lot of frustration for new miniature painters, where you find yourself going over the same spot over and over again and you don't quite understand why the color isn't looking the way that you think it should be looking. It's because you're reactivating the paint underneath it, and it starts to kind of mush it up and break it up, and then you end up with all kinds of weird textures that you're not really sure why you have. And some of my early miniatures that you've seen already suffer from that in a few places, and it's pretty obvious once you know what you're looking for. So once you get a nice finish on the model, do your best to just kind of let it dry all the way. If you've gotten a nice thin base coat across the board, it should only take like 10 or 15 minutes maximum to cure all the way. I want to take a quick second to talk about brush care. How do we keep our brushes good? Now, I have an entire video on how to wash and clean brushes, so we're not going to go super in depth. If you want more in depth, you can go check out that video. But just know that washing your brush out often and reapplying paint to it is a really great way to keep a nice sharp tip on your brushes. A lot of hobbyists start licking their brushes, and this is really a habit that you shouldn't get into, but most of us do it anyway. You'll notice a lot of us do it. I do it. I only do that with acrylics. And any brush that doesn't have acrylic in it ends up in a completely different cup of brushes so that I never accidentally put poison in my mouth. But don't do what I do. Just don't even get into the habit. If you can avoid it, just don't get into the habit. But it will keep a tip on a brush way longer if you keep it clean. Now, what happens if you accidentally let paint dry in the brush? Well, we're going to go to our good friend rubbing alcohol. If you're using synthetic brushes, which means it's not made from real hair, it's going to be a little bit more durable, but you're going to put a couple of drops of rubbing alcohol in your hand, and you're going to lightly massage it into the brush by gently pushing the brush into the palm of your hand and kind of spinning it around and making a circular motion, and that's going to work the rubbing alcohol into the brush. And you might need to do this 4 or 5 times, but you're going to keep doing it until paint stops coming out of the brush, and then you're going to clean it really thoroughly with water. You're going to do your best to kind of get the tip back into that brush, and then you're going to set it somewhere, hopefully not on its side so that it doesn't droop, but you're going to set it somewhere where it's either going to stay upright, or if you've got like clothespins, you can stick it to something so that it stays in this direction and you get a nice sharp tip. And that is how we keep our synthetic brushes good longer. You can kind of do the same thing with real hair brushes, but you can't be as aggressive when you're cleaning them, at least in my personal experience. Now, I know we haven't touched on a lot of the things that people tend to talk about in these sorts of videos, but I want you guys to get started for you. At the end of the day, we're doing this hobby because we chose to do it. We're doing this because we want to have fun, we want to enjoy the hobby. Whether that's because we want our miniatures to look cool on the table, or we just enjoy the process of painting. And I know that not everybody enjoys it, but they want their models to look good. And at the end of the day, this is for you. And like I said at the very start of this, I'm trying to teach from my perspective on what works for me. But I know that that may not 100% work for you, so do take what I and any other content creator say with a grain of salt. Adapt what we teach you and figure out what works best for you. If you don't want to go 100% and you don't want to paint every little button, you don't want to edge highlight every little edge, you don't want to do all the shadows and highlights to do realistic lighting, you don't have to. At the end of the day, your model and your army or whatever it is that you're painting is meant for you. And if you're happy with the final result, then I'm happy for you. So what do you need at the end of the day to get started right now? Number one, you need a model you're excited to paint or something that you think is going to be fun to paint, because I promise you, if you don't think it's going to be fun, you're not going to enjoy it. That also leads into, if you're doing this for wargaming, you should probably be collecting an army that you think is going to be fun to paint, because you're going to paint a lot of them, and not enjoying the painting process is a really great way to just never get started, or at least to never keep going. Number two, you're going to need a way to cut the model free from the sprue. I recommend getting some kind of thin-nosed nippers something with a single edge, it's going to be a lot easier to get in there. You can get by with an X-Acto knife, but honestly, having both of them to cut the bulk out and then cut off the little nibs and shave things down nice and flat is really nice. So if you can afford to get both, get both. And paintbrushes. You don't have to get the most expensive ones, but get a nice pack, something that's going to have a nice sharp tip, something that's going to be a little fatter to do the bulk of the basing. That's going to be really great for you. Again, you don't have to buy the most expensive thing. You can buy a variety pack like what I've got here. And then you want to get actual miniature paints. This is where the bulk of your budget should go, if you have a budget, is real miniature paints. I promise you that the quality difference in the acrylic paints for our hobby versus acrylic paints for canvas painting is dramatically different. The pigment is significantly finer, and it's going to make for a much more enjoyable experience to actually use real hobby paints instead of just using generic acrylic paints. At the end of the day, it's about getting started, and it's also about not letting our own self get in our own way. And I feel like a lot of times we don't get into some of our hobbies the way that we want to because we tend to psych ourselves out a little bit. So hopefully sharing some of my process and how I got started and my evolution from when I got started to now is at least been inspiring to you guys. Now do keep in mind that I have been painting since 2014. As of recording this video, it's 2026. That is a long time to do miniature painting, and in the very beginning when I was doing commissions for about 8 to 10 hours a day for almost 2 years straight for my local gaming group. That is a lot of time to sink into learning techniques, different styles, figuring out what works for me. So if you're not where you think you should be by the time you're done painting your first model, don't beat yourself up over it. Now, if I could leave you with one piece of advice, assuming that you're going to start painting if you haven't already, do your best to see your first miniature all the way through. If you don't like how it's turning out, that's fine. Try to keep painting until it's done. I promise you, you are going to learn so much more if you paint the model from start to finish, whether you like something that's happening in the middle or not. You are going to learn so much more about how to paint through a mistake, how to work around something that you think is wrong, how to correct something by seeing it through all the way to the end, even if the model doesn't turn out the way that you wanted it to. That all said, I highly encourage you to at least keep your first model so that you can remind yourself of how far you've come in your journey. But at the end of the day, if you really aren't happy with what you've done and you're pretty confident you can do better on your second time around now that you know what you're doing, you can use rubbing alcohol to clean the model back off. Just get the highest proof you can find. I get mine from Walmart. I get 90% proof. You just soak it in some rubbing alcohol for like a minute or two and then lightly scrub it with an old toothbrush or some cotton swabs, and 90% of it comes off. Anything that's stuck in the detail, you can use a toothpick and just lightly scrape at it with a toothpick and it will come off. If a little bit's left over, that's fine. When you paint over it, you're not going to notice, but you're going to be able to get about 90 to 99% of it off. I hope you guys really have taken at least something I've said today with a grain of salt, and I hope that some of you are excited to take your first step in the hobby or get back into a hobby that maybe you were overwhelmed when you first got started. In any case, I've been Graham Johnson with Tabletop Glory, and until next time, may your display case always be filled and your pile of shame never run empty.